Is there biblical evidence for an eyewitness for the resurrection, and what is that?
Okay, well, even critics admit, even critics who don't believe in the resurrection will still say Paul, at least, is an eyewitness to a resurrection appearance. They'll all make that comment. Then beyond that, in North America, probably the leading New Testament critic is Bart Ehrman.
Yes.
And Bart Ehrman says that probably after Paul, the next closest trail we get to an eyewitness is not the Gospels, because he doesn't like the Gospels so much. I mean, he finds a lot of evidence there for Jesus, but he still doesn't like them that much. He thinks the second best trail to eyewitnesses is when Paul went to Jerusalem in Galatians chapter 1 and met for 15 days with Peter and James. And of course, those three names, Paul, Peter, James, they're the three single names in that early creed, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7. Then Paul adds his name in verse 8. So those are the three names. But they also were part of the groups that saw Jesus, at least the 12, and the group called all the apostles, and maybe the group called the 500. So Ehrman thinks that when Paul interviewed James and Peter, and then he came back later, Galatians 2, and did the same thing 14 years later. This is all before a single New Testament book was written. But Ehrman says, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than in Galatians 1 and 2? And by the way, when Paul went back in Galatians 2, the Apostle John was also there. So you have John, Peter, Paul, and James, which are easily the foremost influential Christians in the early church.
Wow. And what do you find to be the strongest connection in there? Is it the fact that they're part of that early creed as far as the documents go? And what do you make of the gospel accounts themselves?
I think the Gospels play a role, and they're coming back. I could be having a show and tell time here, because as I'm writing, I'm surrounded by a bunch of the best books. But Richard Bauckham's book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is an excellent book on eyewitness testimony in the Gospels. And there are a lot of others. Craig Blomberg's book on the Gospels, and his big one, and others. But I think probably the strongest single evidence for the historical resurrection, if I only take one category, not one verse, but one category, I would take the early creedal data, which might take some explaining. I'll leave that up to you fellas. But the early creedal data, these are oral testimonies that were abroad before the first New Testament book was written, and they were incorporated into the books. And if somebody says, well, that's no good, it's oral testimony, or it sounds like hearsay, or whatever, tell that to the atheist New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman, or tell it to the atheist German New Testament scholar Gerrit Ludemann. Tell these guys, because they say that material, Ludemann says the latest it could be is 3 years after the cross. Wow. Bart Ehrman says that testimony and a number of others go back 1 to 2 years after the cross. And James D.G. Dunn, the British scholar, who is as influential as anybody, Dunn says that creed could date from the same year Jesus was crucified. So what we get here is testimony that's very, very, very early.
That is.
And that, as Ehrman says, Paul probably got it, that or other creeds in Jerusalem from James and Peter right after he was converted, and it dates to before Paul's conversion. That's outstanding for atheist New Testament scholars to allow, like Ludemann and Ehrman.
Yeah, there's a whole T-shirt in that. I mean, more than that, but for those people who have popcorn apologetics from time to time, to know that from within an atheistic academic framework, you can actually get that much of a strong view of a strong view of those eyewitness accounts and how early that seems to have taken root. Now, Steve, can you please pop the next slide up?
Yeah, before we do, I think Harvey's trying to get in. Oh, you got him.
I did find him, but being a male, my multitasking is not as good as my wife's, and often I've had her in my other ear saying, "Phil, focus on the lead speaker. Look at Harvey, he's nice, but not focus." So, Dr. Harvey, Dr. Habermas, Dr. Habermas, Dr. Harvey, Dr. Harvey, Dr. Habermas, Dr. Habermas, Dr. Harvey. That was my Groucho intro. I've been wanting to do one of those for some time. How are you, Harvey?
He's muted.
I'll see if I can unmute from here. Sorry. No, I think his own mic is muted. Good thing we can edit this out of the mix. We'll work on our next question. So I'll chat with Harvey in the background.
That's
okay.
it. Yeah.
Hello, Harvey.
Thank you very much, Gary. I did log on right at the beginning, but I was sitting in the backstage. But I really much appreciated your comments, and very looking forward to some more of the questions that come. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Harvey. And I'm sorry the slide of your computer login didn't show up that clearly on here, but I found you now. So, Steve, on to our second question. If you would move that slide along.
Yeah, we have it now, yeah.
Gary, the minimal facts, that's a term not everyone in churches has heard, but it sounds like a common sense thing to be talking about. When academics are talking about the minimal facts, what are they? Can you give us it doesn't have to be a brief summary, but what is the minimal facts argument, and what are the minimal facts from your point of view?
Well, I'm the one that uses that title, but other people take it. Other people use it, but I don't want to pretend that everybody uses those words. But whether they use the words minimal facts or not, many skeptical scholars, very skeptical scholars, including atheist and agnostic New Testament scholars, often start their lives of Jesus with a list of facts that can be conceded by everybody because the data are so good. In fact, I was talking about Ben Shaw, my TA, who just finished his PhD.
Yes.
He did a dissertation on the resurrection. And in an appendix, he has 20-something of these scholars, critics, who start their case for Jesus by listing facts that everybody concedes. Well, back when I did my dissertation, I mean, it was back in the Middle Ages, but I did it in 1974 to 76, and it was on the resurrection, and that was back in my skeptical days. And back in my skeptical days, I was having a whole lot of doubts about the New Testament. And I remember on several occasions, I sat down and started taking a bunch of notes, and it became my dissertation later. But I thought, okay, if I can't use this passage, and I can't use this passage, and this gospel isn't very much good, and so on, what are the facts I can use to make my case?
So what did you find? I look at this sort of logic involved in that, and to me that's a strong approach. You're trying to go, look, what are the bare bones and what's the foundation? I think it's obviously a sound principle to get into any kind of apologetic or any kind of argument. You don't want to necessarily overload things. But what do you find then are the minimal facts? And Harvey, Steve, if you've got any other questions on the way, just feel free to chip in as well.
Yeah, like I've heard you mention this. I'm trying to think. It was in a recent interview where you mentioned you telling a story where you're sitting on an airplane and you have only a short piece of time to share the minimal facts, and then you went through them, which I thought was quite compelling and So I thought that might help people so that they can clearly understand, because of course we're trying to reach an audience of people who, of course, don't have PhDs, but still want to obviously be able to share the groundbreaking data, if you like, in a simple form, and yet in a compelling way. And I think that your argument there made a lot of sense to me. And so if you could share it like that, that would be really helpful.
Sure. If I were to characterize the historical facts surrounding the crucifixion and resurrection appearances, at least the claims of the New Testament, I would say that the average scholar is going to allow way more data than I use. I use a really small number of facts. I sometimes call them, instead of saying minimal facts argument, I sometimes say the lowest common denominator argument.
Sure.
But lately I've been using 6 and then an add-on, and I'll explain that. I don't know if you folks have me, but I've lost my picture. I don't know if
oh, we've still got you. I'll just move things around a little bit. Okay. You look good. You look great, and the yellow is very fetching for a winter morning in Australia.
That's nice. I don't mind looking at a black screen. So it's okay.
You're doing great. But thanks for asking.
I have used as few as 3 facts. I've used as many as 6. Now, many of these scholars who do this, they're going to allow many more, and they may be atheists or agnostics or other kind of skeptics, or like Jewish New Testament scholars. So nobody can say, "Oh, you're just using your buddy's facts." But if I use just 6, I would say Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples had experiences which they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. They were proclaimed, these experiences were proclaimed very early, and we already talked about that. Critics allow maybe the same year, and within 1 to 2 years, the story's out there, before Paul was even converted. 4, they turned the world upside down, the Mediterranean world, with their preaching. And I don't claim they all had to be martyred, but we do have first century martyrdom stories for the big 3 who met there in Jerusalem, namely Paul, Peter, and James, the brother of Jesus. We do have first century sources for their martyrdoms. And fourthly and fifthly, 2 skeptics, James and Paul, both claimed to have met Jesus. They were previously unbelievers. They both met Jesus because they thought they saw him alive. And I tacked the empty tomb onto that because there's as much evidence for the empty tomb as there is for any of the other facts. But my requirements for the minimal facts are that each one be evidenced by many facts, dozens, as a matter of fact, on these 6. But critics have to admit them almost unanimously. Well, the empty tomb isn't admitted unanimously. It's probably at about the 75% mark on my head count since 1975. And so I use 6, what I call 6 plus 1, the 6 that make the grade plus the empty tomb. Those are the ones I would use.
Well, that sounds great. I'm sure someone could turn that into a bookmark tool for people. Harvey, have you got a question there I can hear there?
Yes, I actually do. Thanks, Gary. It has to do just with the claimed historical site for the empty tomb. Many people have been to the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem. What sort of evidence is there that we have any certainty of a site, historical or not, that would point to it being a legitimate option for where Jesus was laid?
Well, first of all, scholars, comparatively speaking, seldom answer that question. It's just not an issue to them.
Okay.
But those who do answer it say that the Garden Tomb is definitely out, but the tomb in the Sepulchre, in the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, which is now interfaith. It's shared in an interfaith capacity, for those who are asking that question. But that Jesus's tomb was way, way, way down below the main structure, and that he very well could have been buried there. But again, it's not a big question to the scholars, critical or otherwise. But those who answer the question say that's our best shot, and there's a good chance that's it.
Steve, any other thoughts from you on the minimal facts?
Well, perhaps just one. For if putting myself into the shoes of a lay person who probably doesn't have the time or the desire like me to sit down and read several 700-page books, can you point our listeners to if you like, a summarizing book that would help them grasp the minimal facts argument so that they can use this argument in their evangelistic approach?
Sure. I'm prejudiced, but I would say maybe the best. It's about a 350-page book, half the size of the others, but it's made for intelligent, lay people who want to read and study, and there's 100 pages of endnotes if people want to go further than that level in the same book. But it's called "The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus," and it's co-authored by myself and Mike Lacona. But Bill Craig has an excellent book. William Lane Craig has an excellent book called "The Sun Rises," and that's still available. It can be purchased at Amazon, I believe. And I'd say those two books for minimal facts for a lay audience that are much smaller than the 700-page books. Those are great places to start.
Excellent. I think probably Phil, when we finish up with the recording, we'll try and put all those resources.
That's right. We'll make those there. And for people like Ringo the cat, who's watching from Scotland, who's joined us, we'll make those available. If you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll be able to get updates from there to our website, where you'll be able to see those books. Steve, can you move us on to the next slide, please? And this one here, 1 Corinthians 15 explains the idea of the of a creedal statement, and you did start bringing up and starting to discuss the creedal statements, and Paul was drawing on an early creedal statement. So was Paul drawing on an early creedal statement there in 1 Corinthians 15, and what's the evidence of that? And then secondary, what are the implications of that? This is an area I think we can feel free to dig into and show the importance of those things for some people, like a Christian, a lay person who goes, so why is that meaningful?
Sure. Good question. In the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul does this twice, and he mentions a creedal tradition a third time. So all that's in one book, 1 Corinthians. But in 1 Corinthians 11, talking about the Lord's Supper, and then again in 1 Corinthians 15, he uses almost identical words. And in 1 Corinthians 15, what he says is to the Corinthians, he says, I gave you what I received. And he repeats this. He just got done telling them the first two verses that when he came to Corinth, he preached the gospel. And the gospel is usually defined, if the factual content of the gospel is usually defined in the New Testament, it's the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And Paul said, I preached that to you when I came to Corinth. And if you believed in Jesus, you're saved. And if not, you're not. Well, people might think, well, that's pretty easy. Believe? Okay, I believe. But the word in Greek, pistuo and pistis, the words in Greek mean to commit yourself to Jesus. So I often say it's like marriage. It's like saying the magic words, I do. It may only be 2 words, but it'll get you married for life if you don't break it up. And that's what following Jesus is. It's a life commitment. And then that's when he says, this is the gospel I preached. I gave you what I received as of first importance. And then the words that Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures, was buried, rose again the third day according to the scriptures, and appeared to Peter and the 12. And then after that, there's an ongoing list that has two more individuals, James, and Paul adds his name later in verse 8. And then three groups, the 12, a group called the 500, and a group called all the apostles, which seems to be broader than the 12, but less than the 500. For sure less than the 500, maybe twice the size of the 12 or something. But so Paul said, and what? Okay, no. So why do critics take this seriously? Because they think that 1 Corinthians 15 is one of the 7 books, the epistles of Paul. There's 13 with Paul's name on it, but critics will grant you're free to use 7 of them because they think they're authentic Pauline epistles, and they wouldn't even think Paul could be wrong, but critics don't think Paul is a liar, and therefore when he says I got this from somebody else and it was the heart of the message, they think Paul's telling the truth. He got it early. And Bart Ehrman, back to the agnostic or atheist scholar, he goes back and forth in those words. He thinks it was in existence. That creed was in existence. Other creeds, 1 Corinthians 11, in existence before Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. So very, very early and very, very authoritative because it comes from Paul, Peter, and James in Jerusalem.
And I find it fascinating too, Gary, and maybe Harvey and Steve, you've got thoughts on this, but with the skeptical scholars, that they are happily to take an evidentiary approach, almost like an archaeological approach to what they see, as in, this was handed down and this was handed down. So they're trusting the transmission of the message, just not the intent or the content, right, or the impact behind that. What do you make of that?
Well, that's a great question, and that's for a skeptic who's going to push, or a thinking Christian who wants to push. And I would say we already mentioned how early they are. Secondly, the fact that Paul went to Jerusalem himself. He gives the time in Galatians 1. He says 3 years after he was converted. So critical scholars put this at 35 AD. They generally put the crucifixion to 30.
Yes.
And whatever you think the year is of the crucifixion, just add 5 years. They think Paul was in Jerusalem 5 years after the crucifixion. That's when he met with James, a brother of Jesus, and Peter for 15 days. Later he goes back, meets with the same two fellows and John, and they're specifically discussing the facts of the gospel, he says. And so now you have a very early passage mentioned by Paul, and let's just go to the atheist New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman says these creeds, and there's a bunch of them in the epistles and in the book of Acts, and he says they probably all originated in Jerusalem. They could have come from the apostles, and they probably were in existence before Paul started his journey as a non-Christian to Damascus to persecute Christians. So just take what Bart Ehrman says, and Bart Ehrman says himself. He calls it, by the way, this argument one of the 2 best arguments for the historicity of Jesus. And since the other one is the cross, the crucifixion, where he gives 15 independent evidences, 4 of them not even the New Testament. He gives 15 independent evidences for the crucifixion. One of his 2 best evidences is on testimony after the crucifixion. So I think we're in pretty solid territory here.
That sounds great. Harvey, keen for your thoughts. Oh, sorry, Steve, you were just jumping in.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to possibly ask, or wonder what you felt, because obviously you've been researching this for a long while. One of the things you keep hearing, I guess, from apologists, theologians, pastors, and people asking questions these days, because there's a lot of Christian denominations, there's a lot of Christian diverging thought on, let's say, adiaphoras and secondary issues. And to me, the 1 Corinthians 15 tends to be the, if you like, the most foundational core message, which I would call what is the gospel, which is what people are asking for, looking for. And it seems to me like that's a really great bit of data to give the earliest attestation of what the very early church, and particularly here Paul, actually believed was the gospel. And in a sense, what should be I think, a very unifying characteristic of all Christian belief. And I wonder what your thoughts are there.
No, I think you're right. From a more of a Christian viewpoint that just kind of reads Galatians and says this has the marks of truth. But when you get the skeptics like Bart Ehrman, like Gerrit Ludemann, the German, here's another one for you. Pinchas Lapide was a Jewish scholar, a non-Christian Jewish scholar with a PhD in New Testament. I heard him say one time he was only one of 4 Jewish scholars in the world at that time, a couple decades ago, but he said he was one of only 4 Jewish scholars with a PhD in New Testament. He got it in Germany, by the way, post-World War II Germany. That was really something. But he's Jewish, and he wrote a book in the early 80s, 83, I think, and it's called The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective. And he believes in the resurrection of Jesus.
Fascinating.
And but he's not a Christian. He believes in the resurrection of Jesus. And on that passage in 1 Corinthians 15, he gives 9 reasons to believe it's eyewitness and to believe it's historical and to believe it's true. So it's a major, major passage.
I think we'll get Steve some kind of comparison table, put it into a PDF and attach it under our website view of this video when we're there as well. There's quite a few things I think where people could just look at that and get a snapshot view, and then they could laminate it and use it in their Bibles to hold the pages as well. You've got to make these things practical. Harvey, you threw some questions into the chat. Your mic's open.
Yeah, thank you. I was fascinated to hear about a Jewish scholar who wrote about the resurrection of Jesus and believed in it. Of course, Paul's statement in Romans saying that, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, well, the second part of that might have been true for the Jewish scholar writing his PhD, but of course the first part, believing that he is Lord, would be, I would have thought, an inescapable conclusion if God had raised him from the dead, but evidently not enough. The 2 questions I have got for you, Gary, are: to what extent do you think that the accounts of the resurrection were contributed to by the female disciples and Jesus' mother and those who actually witnessed his death on the cross and went to the tomb? How much evidence is there that their contribution was believable and unique, perhaps, among writings of that time?
Great question. If you folks are familiar there, it's mostly an American movement, but if you're familiar with the Jesus Seminar, it's a group of very, very skeptical scholars. They reject 10 to 20% of the so-called red letter words of Jesus. So they're very skeptical. And when they list how many verses have backup in the New Testament, they talk about several sources for these appearances that have more than one source and are therefore to be respected more. And in that list is the appearance to Paul. And that list is the appearance to even groups of people, which is very evidential. But then in a footnote, down at the bottom of that page where they're evaluating these forms, these skeptics, they say, we also have to include the appearance to, and they either say Mary Magdalene or to the women as a whole. And then another German scholar, Helmut Kirster, another skeptic, he also says the same thing. He says the data for the appearances look good. And he said the closer you get to the appearances to Peter, the disciples, and the women, he said the more trustworthy and reliable this looks. And again, I just keep saying, for skeptics to concede this, that's sobering. That's very sobering grounds, because you're not going to see that anywhere else. In fact, what if I maybe pleased you gentlemen by citing an Australian historian, Paul Barnett?
Oh, yes.
And Paul Barnett, in one of his books on the historical Jesus, he's got a set of them. But in one of his books, he says these early sources for Jesus are earlier and stronger than any other ancient person given their historical sources for them. He said Jesus has the earliest and best sources of any of them.
That's brilliant. It's so good to hear that.
Takes an Australian.
Yes.
It is.
The second question I've got for you too, Gary, is there's been a lot written about the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo. Can you make a comment on this providing any evidence, or is it a red herring?
Well, complicated question for a short answer, but I actually I've co-authored 2 books on the Shroud of Turin, and the reason I say that, my co-author was the editor and spokesman for the team of scientists who did the investigation in 1978 in Turin, Italy. And he was a professor. He was in this famous carpool where there were 4 professors from the Air Force Academy in the middle of the U.S., Colorado Springs, and they would go to work in a carpool. And it was a kind of a typical cross section of people who might study, diverse. My co-author is an African American, and he became a Christian about that time. 2 other men there were Roman Catholic, and the 4th one was an agnostic. So, and 2 of their best friends who did the work with them included the Jewish scholar Barry Schwartz, whose website shroud.com is the best thing out there, and then another photographer who was they were the chief photographers in the team, and he was a Mormon. So it was a real cross section. Anyway, I don't think the Shroud of Turin has to be the burial garment of Jesus, but I do think the evidence is very intriguing. And it's, what should I say, pretty likely. I mean, when I get asked questions like, where do you put it on your probability chart? How probable do you think it is? I'll say, well, I really don't think it's as good, not because there's any weaknesses in the Shroud, just because of the strength of the historical argument. I would take the creedal argument of 1 Corinthians 15 over the Shroud. And I make enemies when I say that, I guess, but among the Shroud aficionados. But I would put the Shroud. People say, well, how likely do you think it is? And I teasingly say, it depends on what side of the bed I woke up in the morning, or it depends on what kind of a mood I'm in.
You know what they say, Gary? They say,
but I could.
Shroud is a shroud.
Yeah, they call the group the crowd, the Shroud crowd. Yeah, I would think it's 80 to 90% likely. But I don't put it up there with historical evidence. I just think I don't even use it, as you know already. Haven't even used it in my argument, but I think it's a confirming, at least a category that deserves some real seriousness.
It's good to know.
Do you think perhaps that the Oviedo, the face cloth of Jesus that was found in I think there's a chapel in northern Spain, in Oviedo, which is purported to be the one that one of the women mopped Jesus' face during the walk through the Via Dolorosa, and had some links to the Shroud, and certainly a greater historical validity in terms of having been mentioned, I think, in the 600s in extra biblical writings as having been in existence. Again, there's tantalizing evidence for some of the things, but not enough to get you over the line, almost as if it requires some faith in it. And am I right in saying that?
Yeah, if you want to keep it totally in the scientific realm, the advantage of the Shroud is that It has been tested. There's empirical data. People can reject it, but there's empirical data. There are thousands of photographs in all kinds of light spectrums, infrared, ultraviolet, and tests like physical spectroscopy and so on. And they did about everything they could do to the shroud without destroying it. And since the carbon-14 has lately been set aside by some intriguing scientific data, I think it leaves the door open. I think the shroud has to be allowed, at least, on the table, to be studied. So I think it's good evidence.
Well, let's go to, thanks, Harvey. Thanks for bringing up something like that so early in the morning before my first cup of coffee as well. Now we've got one more. Oh, you've been down to Old John's. Old John's is one of our favourite cafes here, Gary. And in Australia, we're not meaning to brag, but we can go to cafes now. And our coffee here is quite good. So if you ever get to make the trip out of Virginia down to the east coast of Australia, we'll make sure to introduce you to some real coffee if you're into that sort of thing. Although you may be a tea drinker, who knows?
I drink real strong coffee.
Good on you.
I'm German, and that's the kind of coffee I drink, and I would love to have a cup of it right now if you can pass it over.
Yeah, we can do some digital printing, I think. So as we look, I think, Steve, this is our last question, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
it is. And that's a little painting I threw together myself over the weekend. No, actually, it's not. Non-biblical sources for the resurrection. And I think we've danced around this a little bit this morning, but in our last 5 or 10 minutes or so, Gary, the non-biblical sources for the resurrection, what do they actually say? And what is the implication for Christianity from your perspective?
Well, let me back up a little bit. I think there are I've got a book on this. So, I mean, there is data out. There are data, and people can look it up. But my book is called Historical Jesus. And don't do that. I'm not trying to sell copies. It's actually out of print. But I asked the question, how many sources can we get for Jesus up to 150 years after his death? And I end up with 12.5 sources, all outside the New Testament, and none of them Christian. Okay. Bart Ehrman, the atheist, he goes 100 years after crucifixion. And he lists 15 different sources, 4 of them outside the New Testament, for the crucifixion alone. So there's some good data. Now, on resurrection, you'd have to look at those who think, which is still a majority view, that Josephus makes a couple of important points. A Jewish historian makes a couple good points about Jesus, and a later one about James, where he calls Jesus the brother of the so-called Christ. And it's frequently believed, the majority view, is that the longer Josephus passage in his volume Antiquities was probably doctored by Christians a little bit, but that the heart of the message is still there. Josephus knows who Jesus was and probably said something like his disciples thought he was raised from the dead, not the stronger message that you sometimes read that he was raised from the dead. That doesn't make too much sense for Josephus to say. He was a Pharisee, and that doesn't work. So Josephus would be one there. And if you allow Christian sources that are outside the New Testament, not in the New Testament, the information increases rather considerably. In the book, The Historical Jesus, I produce a half dozen comments from early Christian writers who give historical comments on the resurrection. For example, just to give you one, Ignatius, who wrote just slightly after the Gospel of John. Ignatius is writing about 107 AD, and that's about 10 years after the Gospel of John is normally dated. And where John and Luke say that Jesus presented himself and let people touch him, Ignatius says, just 10 years later, that when he presented himself, they indeed reached out and touched him. And I'll just remind you, we do have sources of both Matthew and John where women touch Jesus. So there's these touching verses. But Ignatius says that from 107 AD outside the New Testament. So we do have some data on the resurrection, but still, critics are going to tell you. Critical scholars, the guys I talk to all the time, atheist New Testament scholars, they're kind of fun to talk to. I just had one on my PhD class a few weeks ago, and he addressed my students, and I promised not to get involved in the dialogue. It was a lot of fun. But these guys will tell you that the strongest evidence are these creeds. It's these early creeds because they're early date from authoritative people claiming to have seen appearances of Jesus to groups and individuals. And I think that's way stronger than sources outside the New Testament. But I understand some people want the sources outside the New Testament, and they're there too.
Yeah.
Gary, can I ask you a little bit about that? When individuals are primarily writing about an event they either eyewitnessed or saw, that's a sort of first level of evidence. But there are a number of writings, from what I understand, where an author refers to another author who has written about what they saw, what they heard. And I bring this up with regard to a reference made to an African author who had spoken about a darkness coming over the part of Israel at the time of the crucifixion and a great earthquake. And I think this was one of the Alexandrian, either Origen or one of the Alexandrian early church fathers, who was referring to a previous piece that we haven't got, but
right.
How reliable is evidence like that?
Oh, that the fellow's name is Thallus, the ancient history writer, and his account is repeated by a fellow named Julius Africanus, and so we get it from a source. You know, I was right. He's that's one of the 18 sources I cite. Now, it's not the best one. There are questions. Critics would rather use Tacitus and Josephus. Critics use those two, but on Thallus, it very well could predate the Gospels. Not the earliest epistles of Paul, but Thallus is often dated to about 52 AD. And he talks about the darkness, like you said, and it's reported later. So I would call that, I do call it one of my 18 sources after the crucifixion of Jesus. He could very well, if this works out, if it's what it seems to be, Thallus would be the earliest secular writer to mention the life of Jesus, and he does it just 20-something years later.
Wow. Fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harvey. Gary, I think we're towards the end of our time now, but there's just one bonus question that we'd like to throw in, because that's how we like to roll.
Is this for extra points?
It is extra points, actually. And when you do make it, it's extra points. And when you make it to Australia, it's for all the free coffee that you can take, and we'll make sure you get it.
That makes it worth it.
That makes your day, yeah. Here's a good one. What is the evidence, biblical and non-biblical, for the seemingly fantastic events described in Matthew 27, between 50 and 54? Could you lead in and summarize what your thoughts are around that?
Yeah, now you're talking about evidence. So that's, you ask what's the evidence, and that makes it very difficult. Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, the extremely well-known New Testament scholar, Tom and I are friends, have been together for a lot of times, and I'll tell you, Tom is the closest thing to a walking encyclopedia that I know. He's just really good. And when he deals with this material, he says, I've heard him say it more than once, he says, I read those words there, and I'm not sure what to do with them. Now, they're in Matthew, and most people think Matthew meant it historically. Some think Matthew meant it metaphorically, like a parable. the majority views that Matthew thought it happened physically. But when you ask the question, what's the evidence for it? There's virtually no evidence that backs Matthew up. And in fact, that's one thing that bothers critics, because it's not recorded in any other gospel. So that's that. I mean, it's not here nor there regarding the resurrection of Jesus, but you have to get into Matthew's mind and get into what he's saying. But then when you start picking up evidence, if you say, what's evidence? To be frank, we don't have any backup for that outside the New Testament.
Sure. Steve, that was one of your hopeful big questions. You've got a minute or two. Anything you'd like to
I think it was actually Harvey's, but
oh, was it Harvey's? I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. No, that's okay. That's all good. But I think, look, if I may say so, I appreciate your honesty, and I think it's, and that's probably what I really like about your approach to the minimal facts is that you use the data that actually is there, and where there's an open question, it's important it's important to be honest about where there's an open question. I think that's important.
Yeah, it's a good point, Steve.
One last tantalizing question, Gary, if you don't mind. Do you think that some evidence exists but is possibly being withheld because of its bombshell possibility of shaking the historical and theological world, and it is out there somewhere, whether it be held in Jewish hands, in Catholic hands, in other hands? Do you think there may be?
Now, I take it you mean negative evidence. Is that true?
It might go either way. If evidence was available, for example, in Jewish writings that suggested there was damage to the temple curtain, or any kind of evidence that they may possess that would support or validate a Christian position. But as from the very beginning, if that evidence was revealed, it may jeopardize their position. So I'm just putting it out there as a tantalizing thing.
So Harvey, some kind of biblical Area 51.
Possibly, yes.
Okay. Gary, feel free to deal with this one in the last minute or two. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I don't know of anything. I can't imagine, with secular forces being what they are, whether it's Australia, or whether it's Northern Europe, or whether it's North America, whether it's South America. I just got a letter this morning from a person talking like that, and they're talking about evidence from another part of the world. They were talking about evidence from Singapore, and they weren't talking about negative evidence. They were just talking about people going after Christianity. And my point is that when there's so many people who want to bring the story down just because they don't believe it, I mean, you can't blame them for not believing, I guess, but I would think it's going to be pretty hard to keep that under wraps. If there is anything, and I couldn't think of anything anyway. The only thing I can think of that could be a bit of a secret, if it really got out there, are some of the things that are known about the Shroud of Turin that people dismiss when they come out because they think everybody's prejudiced, even though there's scientific backup for the points. And what I'm saying here is, I won't mention names, but I know skeptics who work on this. And I was told by one of the best known skeptics, he hopes this one piece of data that, there's evidence that the image on the shroud is radiation, two different kinds of radiation from a dead body that was crucified. And that the image on the shroud shows things coming out from the inside, body parts. Like, for example, they think you can see the backbone. They think you can see the bones in the hands. They think you can see the teeth. And you can find this data online. But there are close-up photos that seem to show the roots of the teeth. And I was showing these slides one time, and a medical doctor was in the front row, and he said, whoa, wait a minute, go back to that slide. And I backed up, and he said, those are teeth. Those are teeth on his underneath the lip of the man in the shroud. It's not because the skin was ripped. You can just see the teeth right through it. Now, if there's radiation coming from inside the body out, and this man's finally dead, one of the earliest books on the shroud actually concluded that the shroud was a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I mean, I think that's going a little far, and I think we can't prove the shroud that well, but you know what? There are no contrary evidences that blow it away. So that might be your secret. I don't know.
Well done, Harvey.
Yeah. Nicholas Allen, who's a professor of art at Port Elizabeth University, actually was a school colleague of mine. And he spent an enormous amount of time trying to reconstruct some sort of artwork to explain away the shroud. So I remember Nick very well. He was a fantastic artist and sculptor, but he was certainly on the side of the skeptics. But your knowledge has been fascinating, and we could do this again and again and again. We loved having you, Gary. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, folks. I enjoyed it. And you know what I'm going to walk away with? You might be walking away with the shroud and the evidence. I'm walking away thinking about that steaming cup of coffee.
It's coming. It's one thing about modern Australia is we used to go, our forebears used to go on these things called a pub crawl on a Friday night, you know, and I didn't. I'm just saying that, but they'd go from pub to pub to pub. Now it's middle-aged men in Lycra from their cycling who go from cafe to cafe to cafe, all charged up on their Java, and they love it. It's a hit.
Look, I mean, you know, I spent most of my childhood in Germany, and Germans can make good coffee, but I have to say, like, I've been in Australia now for 20 years, and Australian coffee is pretty good.
Hey, I'll tell you guys a real quick story. I was in Stockholm one time, and they asked me if I wanted coffee. And I said, absolutely. And they said, do you want Swedish coffee or do you want American coffee? Well, I knew what they were asking. And I said, no, I want Swedish coffee. And they said, are you sure? It's very strong. I said, I'm positive. I want Swedish coffee. Are you sure? And I said, yes, Swedish coffee. And the guy told me, he said, downtown in a coffee house in Stockholm, he said they have different flavors from countries. And, you know, Italian coffees for lovers and so on. Yes. But he said by American coffee, it said American coffee is for wimps. I don't know if that name means anything. Yeah, American coffee is for wimps. And I said I said that's precisely why I want Swedish coffee.
Oh, very good, very good. Oh, Gary, thanks very much. It is a good note to finish on. And from here, Gary, I just want to say thanks for being on board with us today. I really genuinely appreciate your time and generosity to share what you know and have taken time and studied and distilled. Believe you're doing it obviously as a scholar, but also as a fellow believer, fellow disciple. And we genuinely appreciate and respect that. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
thank you, folks. I enjoyed it very much. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.